you'll hear more of their story in a moment. My own journey in publishing took me from being an editor in Germany to the UK, several years in Sweden, the Netherlands and the US, and moments of realization along the way about some of the environmental impacts of our industry. One was, as a young commissioning editor, I went to the warehouse at Hodder and Stoughton then, and in the returns department, I saw them dealing with all these things coming back in from bookshops, and they were putting the hardbacks on a trolley, and I noticed that all the paperbacks were going on a conveyor belt, and I thought, I wonder where that goes. And I went out and followed the conveyor belt out, and they went into a skip. They were just churning out all the time into a skip, because it wasn't worth putting them back. And who knows, in those days, probably the skip went to landfill. A later one was at the University of Birmingham. I was researching journal pricing models for Taylor and Francis, in fact. And it was in that transitional time, 2004, many publishers had gone digital with, or started to go digital with journals. But the typical pricing model then was you got the digital free with your print subscription, which was, what was it really it was about. And the very smart librarian there told me that the print journals were delivered straight to a skip in the car park, because she didn't actually want them cluttering the place up. She wanted the digital journals. So there we are. Skips feature in my memory of sustainability journey. We, as an industry, we've come a long way, but we have a long way to go, and we will consider that journey today. We are going to focus on the environmental aspects of sustainability, so the other social, economic, human areas we can't fit into this hour, but I'm confident that we will have a rich session with this wonderful panel. The core of the session will be a discussion amongst us all, and I've already detected it's getting lively up here before we even started, so that's good. And there will be an opportunity for Q&A. But before we do that, I'd like each of the panel members to set the scene a little about themselves, about the role that they're doing, and about the kind of things that they're working on. So I wonder if Zoe could start us off on that little journey.
Thanks, Oliver. Hi, everybody. So I'm Zoe. I work at Oxford University Press. The first sort of point that I've got is what led me into a sustainability role. I've worked in sustainability for about, I dread to say, coming up to 20 years. Initially studied biology and conservation and went to work for environmental organisations, including a branch of the UN Environment Programme in Cambridge, which was really fascinating. But I had that moment where you look at your boss's job and think, is that the job I want next? And the answer was no. And I looked at the other jobs in the sector, and it involved either living in a tent in the Kalahari, which wasn't really my vibe, as I'm sure it's beautiful, or the kind of really great roles were in countries around the world that, again, would be fascinating to visit, but my base was in the UK. And I thought, well, this, on the one hand, this isn't quite where I want to be going, but also I want to feel like I'm really making a difference, not tied up in red tape and sort of UN bureaucracy and things. And I have friends working in corporate sustainability, and I thought, well, actually, that sounds really interesting. So to cut a very long story short, ended up working at a company called Pentland Brands, which owns Speedo and Berghaus and Canterbury, apparel and footwear, basically. And I was there for 10 years in various sustainability roles. And I was there until I joined the press back in 2020. In terms of what I do now, my focus, so I'm a one-person band. I am the sustainability department and director of myself. So I'm responsible for our strategy on sustainability, but also working really closely with our operational teams. We've obviously got the team that work with suppliers, the team that work with our sort of freight and distribution supply chain, and real estate as well. So working with all those teams to make sure that they know what their contribution needs to be and make sure we're getting the data we need and all that sort of thing. And then the last point in terms of what I'm doing in my role is a bit more holistic. So we've signed, and probably many of the organisations in the room have signed the SDG Publishers Compact. And as part of my role, I chair, maybe too formal a word, convene a group of colleagues from all different parts of OUP to talk about the SDGs and what we're doing, both in terms of operations, which is sort of my area, but also our published content, and our stakeholder engagement as well. So that's a really nice kind of extra holistic bit of work that I do. The final point I've got is around issues I think important to consider. The first one relates to that holistic point. So it would be very easy for me to go into great detail about our carbon footprint data and the operations. But actually, and this is one thing that Scott and I were just touching on, is the role of a publisher, and specifically a university press, as I think we've got a unique channel to raise awareness and to reach people with content on environmental challenges and solutions and sort of inspire positive change. And then back to the operational side, I mean, our footprint is predominantly in our print manufacturing supply chain, far outweighs our digital footprint in terms of product. So actually how we really make change through our suppliers, given that we don't print books ourselves anymore, we very rarely source paper ourselves. It all has to be done 2 or 3 steps removed. And I'll stop there. I told you I'd talk a lot.
Yeah, thank you very much. So, very interesting introduction. Scott, over to you with a slightly different perspective on things.
Oliver, thank you. And thank you to the organisers of the conference for inviting me here and for your time this morning. I'm Scott Davidson, Deputy Director, Social Responsibility and Sustainability for the University of Edinburgh. I'm not a publishing expert, so I don't understand this sector particularly well. I understand the basics, I think, more broad sustainability. How did I come into this? So I'm a social psychologist by trade. So what I studied and what I was fascinated in and remain fascinated in is what makes us happy as human beings, what drives us, cognitive dissonance, what does a meaningful life look like, etc. And in the course of studying that, it was obvious to me as a young man that climate change was going to be one of the biggest challenges that we could face as a generation, and that could be the most meaningful thing that I could do with my life. And I still believe that to this day. And it looks like that will be my career for my whole life and my mission, indeed, my personal mission. My role now, my focus, my role, it's a funny one, and I think my sustainability colleagues here will recognise this. I have no executive power or authority over anything anyone does, and that's always been the case in my roles. My roles are always persuasion and influence. I have no teeth. I charm people into submission on sustainability to the very best of my ability, because of course everything that we do, the impact that the university has is through our learning and teaching, and I don't control that. Through our research, I don't control or influence that. Through our operations and the way that our estates run, our buildings run, our transport works, I have no say in any of those things really either. So what I have to do is try and influence and persuade all of the key people who do make the executive decisions and those things. And indeed, that's what my team does as well. I'm blessed with a significant team here. So we have dedicated staffing of just under 50 people on social responsibility and sustainability, which I think is a great credit to the university, that they put so much resource into this, and that's why we're able to do a lot of the things that we do. In terms of things to share today, there'll be some slides that will come up in the discussion later, but I suppose I would say 3 things. Urgency, and I'm going to try and visualize why that's important. It's obvious to say urgency, but I'm going to really try and sort of bring that home. Breadth, I'm going to hopefully knock the scope 3 isn't our responsibility argument out of the park. And materiality. I'm going to focus on a very old report called Simple and Painless, and talk about why small actions won't get us there. And that would be my 3 messages today: urgency, breadth, materiality.
Great, thank you. Kathy, let's complete the trio of introductions.
Thanks. Yes, I'm Kathy Hodgson. I'm the Sustainability Manager at Taylor & Francis Group, and interesting listening to what Scott and Zoe have been saying, because in some ways my role and my background is a bit of a mixture of both of yours in some respects. I've been with Taylor & Francis for 9 years now, and for my sins I started out working in marketing, so apologies if any of you are marketers in this room. I did that for about 4 years, and similar to Zoe, I looked at my boss's job after about 4 years and went, oof, I really don't want to do that. And I looked at my boss's job, and I was like, I really don't want to do that either. But luckily at the time, they were recruiting for somebody to work on TNF's sustainability program. And somehow I managed to convince them to hire me. I'm not sure why. My background is not in environmental sciences. I also have a degree in music, which is not relevant to sustainability at all. But I did understand the business. I understood how to communicate with people and how to communicate messages that are effective and that are tailored to different audiences. And that's probably one of the reasons they hired me. My role is a bit of jack of all trades, master of none. I do a lot of environmental sustainability work, similar to what Zoe and Scott look at, but I also look at how we make sustainability a competitive differentiator for the business, so that it is not just a bunch of tree huggers saying this is the right thing to do, but that it is a commercial element for the business as well. So looking at the content that we publish, what does that do to address large societal problems, whether that's things like gender equality or climate action or quality education, and our role in global scholarly publishing and pushing those agendas forward. And the final thing that I've started to look at sits more in the social responsibility side of things. So what is the value that we as an academic publisher provide to society, whether that's in the communities where we are physically based, or whether that's to the global scholarly publishing ecosystem as a whole. So yeah, that is broadly
Excellent.
what I do.
Thanks so much, Kathy. So we've got a wonderful range of perspectives: the large university press, the university itself, and the public company focused, however, on the university sector. I think this will be most instructive. Let me just get to know the audience. Does anyone have sustainability in their job title or under their remit? Would you put your hand up? Good. A few brave hands. Excellent. Yeah. Well, if you want to chip in later, you're welcome to, and there'll be an opportunity for that. But let's go into our discussion. And we were thinking about where to start. The business of measuring your baseline and then setting goals for the future is pretty fundamental to this area of activity. And there's quite a lot of persuasion and communication involved too that we've heard about. That goal setting, I wondered in your different settings, and maybe we'll start with the two publishers, how do you express your goals? What's the timescale you talk about? Which are the components that are meaningful for your organisation? Zoe, do you want to talk for OUP?
So just for context, I guess my role was relatively new when I joined in 2020. There'd been someone in on a 6-month contract before I joined to do the baseline, to get the data, because there was a very clear remit to have a sustainability programme. And I'm talking, I guess, specifically about carbon footprint, but it's broader than that. But we had absolutely no idea what our footprint was. So there was someone in gathering that data. I was very lucky to come in and have that large piece of work already done. Obviously, it's evolved since then. And I think that's very instructive, because what it showed us was where the impact sits. And again, this is something we were touching on a little bit earlier, to set the scene. So half of our footprint, our carbon footprint, comes from paper. Roughly another 20% comes from printing, and then it sort of gradually gets smaller from there. So very obviously our biggest impact was in that sort of upstream print supply chain. And once we had that baseline, we then needed to set some targets. And possibly because the instruction was we need some targets really soon, we decided to go relatively short term in the first instance, set targets within our control that seemed manageable and close enough that it would sort of galvanise action. So we've got 3 targets to achieve by 2025. The carbon one, the target is carbon neutrality by 2025 for our own operations, so offices, warehouses, business travel. I hesitate on the neutrality point because there's so much debate about carbon offsetting, but I think that's a discussion for another day. Mm-hmm. We've got a target to source 100% certified sustainable paper for our books and journals, again by 25. And the last one is around waste. And foolishly, I said zero waste to landfill, and then spoke to our markets globally and found out that's only possible in the UK and parts of the US. So the targets are somewhat evolving, but obviously 2025 is really soon. And the next step, which is what I've been working on most recently, is what else do we want to say? So we're working on a net zero target for carbon, which hopefully will be published this year, and then starting to think about a long-term target for nature and biodiversity. And to your point about, measurability, carbon, not everyone, lots of people understand, there's one unit, there's one measurement, there's all sorts of platforms for gathering and presenting that CO2 data. Nature is a whole other ballgame in terms of biodiversity, water, land conversion.
Yeah.
And it, just starting to get to grips with that, really.
Right. And those goals that you've talked about, your 2025 goals, are they communicated around the press? Is there something that
They are.
others would understand?
Absolutely. So
okay.
I get wheeled out to quite a few town halls and that kind of thing to talk about them. And we've got a responsible publishing report. The next one is due out, I think, next week or the week after, which is so I look after just environmental sustainability. The other aspects of sustainability are owned by different teams. So DE&I sits with HR, for example. In terms of raising awareness about what the commitments are, the one thing that I've noticed is we're a very global organisation. The awareness is really good in Oxford, it's really good in New York, pretty good in Spain, and then as you get physically further away, and I think possibly because of COVID and there hasn't been, I haven't been to our locations and there's just that distance, if I spoke to our team in Pakistan, actually, do they know what the targets are? Some of them will because they sit within supply chain and their directors shared the information. But one of my tasks for this year is to join more of their town halls remotely to talk through the existing targets and the new targets and help people kind of understand what their role is, I guess.
Yeah, great. Kathy, how about you? How does it work at TNF?
Yeah, a lot of similarities to all the things that Zoe's been mentioning. We have a target of reaching net zero by 2030 and becoming a zero waste to landfill company by 2030 as well. We had carbon neutrality targets for our entire supply chain and also business operations, which we've now met. The 2030 target, if anybody is familiar with the SBTI definitions of net zero, it's basically 90% reduction, 10% offsets. And with such a large interconnected supply chain reliant on logistics that are nowhere near where they need to be, that isn't achievable. But we're looking at sort of voluntary carbon market initiatives, definitions, and things are evolving and changing and being discussed a lot in this space. So, yes, it remains to be seen what that will look like. But we've gone on quite a big journey in terms of our supply chain. Probably since 2016, we've reduced the amount that's wasted. And our emissions by about 30 to 40%, which we're quite pleased about. It's delivered huge operational efficiencies and money-saving initiatives as well.
So there are fewer of these skips that I mentioned earlier filling up outside the warehouse then?
Nothing that we or our warehouses dispose of is skipped or to landfill. It is all pulped, turned into other paper products. I would hope that customers, whether they are universities, libraries, whatever it is, that they're not actually sending stuff to landfill, that they are actually doing something a bit more sustainable. But yeah, very similar to Zoe, we are very much on the cusp of, okay, we've looked at things through a carbon lens for so long. What about biodiversity? What's our impact there? Yeah. What's the impact of biodiversity loss potentially on us as well. Yeah. And things like water, human rights. I mean, the list goes on and on and on.
Yes.
So
you're never off the hook. No. And Zoe talked of the persuasion and town hall meetings and so on that she's doing. Is that your life as well, doing those kinds of?
Oh, for sure. Yeah. For sure. A lot of engagement with the wider company. Does the message fall on deaf ears? It really depends on who you're talking to.
Yes.
It depends on your audience. And I think the key thing there really is about connecting with people and making it relevant for them or their particular role. A lot of people feel a little bit helpless in terms of it's really great that the company is invested in sustainability, but how is this relevant for me and my role? Or how is this relevant for my customer group, my stakeholder group? And if you can put things in a way that connects better with people, what's relevant for them, what's meaningful for them, your message tends to hit home a little bit better.
Yeah. And you mentioned at the beginning the commercial aspect, that you want commercial advantage through this, which as part of a public company with shareholders is maybe more part of the equation.
It's massively important. Yeah. Taylor & Francis is part of a larger organisation called the Informa Group. It's a publicly listed company. The CEO is a big champion of sustainability, and that works very much in our favour. There's less of me running around with a stick beating people, and less persuasion. People are luckily very, very happy to get on board and do whatever they can to push the sustainability and social responsibility agenda forward, which is really, really helpful.
Yeah. I was at Informa. They also run the Monaco Yacht Show, so they've got their they've got their different issues to worry about rather than. I think you're on the good side of the equation there. So yeah,
no comment.
No comment. Absolutely no. I'm at that nice stage of life. Anyway, great. Thank you very much. Then Scott, over to you. As I wandered around this part of Edinburgh yesterday, I thought. Now Scott's got a rather different perspective. There are all these buildings and things. Tell us how you set goals and.
Yeah. I mean, first I want to congratulate Zoe and Catherine though on the immediacy of the targets. So net zero 2030 and then immediate targets in 2025.
Yeah.
That's very different to what many universities have done. Where, for example, the University of Edinburgh set net zero by 2040. Now that net zero by 2040 is the right target for Edinburgh in that it's just about achievable, just about if we do some really big things very soon, and it's very expensive, etc. But there is a problem with that as well. I don't know if it's the right time to pull up that slide to visualise
Indeed.
that.
Should I press the slide? Here we are.
So, these are 4 alternative pathways to net zero. And they all start at the same point, and they all end at the 90% reduction point. But you can see that the total emissions delivered over those same timeframes are different according to how urgently you take action, right? Mm-hmm. Top left, you got 4 million, bottom right, you got 1.48 million. Now, when you extrapolate that to every organization or every government or every country in the world, the difference between the top left and the bottom right is catastrophic climate change and the death of millions of people, hundreds of millions of people perhaps, or managing to stay within 1.5 degrees. And so universities are very good at setting net zero by 2040, net zero by 2050, etc., etc. What they're not so good at doing is identifying that pathway and sticking to that pathway, those carbon budgets. You've just seen the Scottish Government drop their targets on the same basis, right? So they had annual targets that were very difficult to meet. Now, to be fair, they were only 1% or 2% outside of where they needed to be. So actually they're getting lambasted in the media. And it's unfortunate that they set targets that were ultimately unachievable. But they weren't far away from what they were trying to do. And what they're shifting towards is still 1.5 alignment, as far as I understand it, but on a 5-year carbon budget basis. And that's sensible. That's the right way to do this. So what I would urge other universities to do is to follow that kind of 5-year carbon budget basis. So set your first target at the latest 2030, then 2035, then 2040, depending on how far you go. But I think it's brilliant that you start with 2025 because this is missing in so many university strategies. So really brilliant to do.
So crack on with it.
Just to be clear, so that Scott doesn't think too highly of us. So our first target is just for a portion of our footprint. The net zero target will be longer term.
I still think it's great that you've got initial targets in there to drive urgent action, even if it's only a proportion. And that brings us to scope. I think, I could. Yeah.
Do you want to press?
Yeah, thank you.
Needs a good click on the green to move it on.
So this is the University of Edinburgh's greenhouse gas emissions. You'll see on a quick look at that, essentially our supply chain emissions are up around 65%, something like that. Our scope 3 emissions is what we call it. Those are the emissions that we don't directly impact on, but we indirectly influence. Now, best practice review of UKHE is that typical universities, somewhere between 65 and 85% scope 3 emissions. Now, I once had a senior sustainability expert when I first came into the sector, when I was challenging them on Scope 3, say, but our Scope 3 is someone else's Scope 1 and 2, so we don't need to worry about it. Yeah. We had a good conversation after that, where the questions I asked them was, do you build buildings? Yes. Why do you build those buildings? Well, there's usually a business case behind them. So there's a benefit to you. Well, yes, we usually make money or attract research or attract more students for that. Okay, so you choose to do that. That's your executive decision, yeah. Do you take account of the embodied emissions in that? No, because that's someone else's Scope 1 and 2. Hang on a minute. You're getting the benefits from that. Your business is benefiting from that. You're growing from that, but you're not going to take responsibility for the emissions. I'm sorry, that argument just doesn't wash anymore. It might have washed 10 years ago, but it doesn't wash anymore. So we need to start taking responsibility for our Scope 3 emissions as well, especially when
Scott,
it's 65%.
let's just make sure we've got common language.
Yeah.
Scope 1, 2, 3, let's just make sure we've got those.
Scope 1 emissions is direct emissions on our estate. So it's from the gas boilers burning gas and putting emissions into the atmosphere. It's from vehicles that we own, which are burning diesel and petrol, putting emissions in the atmosphere. It's from leaked refrigerants and things like that, from cooling, etc. Scope 2 is from the electricity that we use. So that's being produced somewhere else, and coal or gas or something else is being burned to produce that, or renewables. And Scope 3 is pretty much everything else. It's largely your supply chain. For us, it's international students as well. Yeah. So we rely a lot on international students in many ways. And we want to keep doing that because we believe the positive impact of our international students is greater than the negative. But we need to take responsibility for the carbon emissions of that as well. And so the University of Edinburgh has a £47 million forest and peatland programme where we've bought 2 giant pieces of land and entered into partnership with lots of others. And the idea of that is doing that now and planting trees and restoring peatland gives us both the biodiversity benefits and allows us to be sequestering the equivalent amount of emissions in 2040 as to that which our international students' flights will be emitting in one trip to us and one trip back home per year is our assumption, essentially. So that's how we take care of the international students part. But my main point here was Scope 3 emissions, was taking responsibility for everything we do as a business because we can influence those areas. So that's how we're taking account of our emissions, and that's the urgency and the breadth piece done. Another quick piece on urgency. Quite often, people, I'll explain what this is in a second. Quite often people make decisions or teams make decisions on what's called marginal abatement cost of carbon, MAC curves, you'll hear about them. So what is the cost of reducing carbon? If I put some solar panels on my roofs, probably the cost is in the negative because I make money out of that through reduced electricity costs and income from the feed-in tariff. So the marginal abatement cost of this saved carbon there is in the negative. But doing the building fabric of some of our oldest buildings, so we have 550 buildings, second largest estate in the UK after Manchester. The oldest one is 1583. Right. It doesn't do with cavity wall insulation in a building in 1583. It just doesn't work. The marginal abatement cost of building fabric for us is in the hundreds or thousands of pounds per tonne of carbon saved. But the MAC basis can be a mistake sometimes. So if you look at this, this is our actual emissions, Scope 1 and 2, up until 22-23, which is your first dashed vertical line. Sorry, I'm pointing down here because I can see a screen down here, but you're looking up there. That's our actual emissions. The solid red line is where we need to be, or under it, to be 1.5 degrees aligned. I'll explain 1.5 degrees in a minute, what I mean by that. What I want to demonstrate is what happens if we delay for just a few years while we get our analysis right, which lots of our colleagues would love to do because we're just not quite ready to make the big decisions yet and spend all of that big money. Well, if we delay for a few years, what happens is we overshoot that red line by the amount that you can see, the area above the red line, and that's now a carbon deficit. So we've overshot by, say, 30,000, 40,000 tonnes. We've got to get back under that red line by an equivalent amount before 2030 based on the advice from the Intergovernmental Panel for Climate Change. So they say we need to reduce emissions by 43% by 2030 to stay within 1.5. 1.5, if we breach that significantly, is the science suggests that that will trigger 5 climate tipping points. That is the collapse of the West Antarctic ice sheet, the collapse of the Barents Sea ice, the collapse of the Greenland ice sheet, the die-off of low-latitude coral reefs, and the abrupt thaw of boreal permafrost. These are planet-changing tipping points. Once they start, they don't stop. You can't reverse them. So we don't want to breach 1.5, right? We all agree with that. Lots of nodding heads usually. Yeah, good. So if we delay by those few years to get back under the red line by the equivalent amount, look how deep we have to go. And the thing is, the easy measures are at the top. That's your solar panels, it's your planting trees, it's your nice, cheap, easy things. As we go further down that line, it becomes increasingly expensive and disruptive. And down there, you're talking about interventions that the university is not going to want to go towards. So when you talk about delayed action at the top and marginal abatement costs, it's the wrong measure. The costs are there. It's the cost of the extreme interventions you want to be capturing and contrasting against that delay in action. This visual is one of the most powerful visuals I've presented in the last 20 years. It really has got the executive, the court, various other committee members going, oh, now I get it. Now I understand why we need to move incredibly quickly. It's not, we'll figure this out in a few years or 5 years. It's, how do we figure this out in the next 6 months? What key actions we're going to take and how quickly we're going to take it. Now, I haven't won the argument yet. We still need the formal approvals, etc. But I just wanted to share that visual as a really powerful tool when you're trying to persuade people around you. And on influence in Scope 3 emissions, I'd urge you to look at the English NHS procurement supply chain roadmap. That gives a roadmap that's probably not big enough for you to read. Oh, maybe it is. Out to 2050. And what they're saying is if you want to be on our supply chain in the future, whoever you are, if you want to supply to us, you're going to have to align with us and do each of these things across the next number of years. So they're giving a long-term view of the supply chain. This is the biggest buyer in the UK. The NHS England is huge. What I'm trying to persuade the university and the wider Scottish HE sector at the moment is to align with this. Because if you're Dell or HP or a major supplier, and you have 40 different net zero commitments to try and align to whenever you're selling to the different procurers that you're selling to, that's a nightmare. Wouldn't it be nice if they were all, if all of public sector, for example, were aligned? And this is a good roadmap, so that makes it easy for Dell and HP and all our major suppliers to line up to this and deliver to it, and it strengthens the power of this as well. So.
Thank you. Great. Good. Since the slides are here, I know that the next slides are just a short advert break in this presentation. I thought, well, I better say something about the IPG while I'm here and what they do. But actually, I would say a nice feature of our industry is we are collaborative creatures, and tremendous that Alps have collaborated with University of Edinburgh Press to welcome us here, and Alps has some wonderful resources. I'll just mention that IPG is active on sustainability with its action group, with the Zero Carbon Toolkit, with a link up with the Publishers Association and access to their carbon calculator, and the book journey projects that have gone on and explored the issues here about the supply chain, which led to the thinking that actually, paper and packaging is certainly one great issue, but the book journeys too was about what happens afterwards and the return cycle and all of that. Anyway, it's all on the IPG website. Do have a look. We'll go back to the conversation. Sorry, I seem to be in need. We've talked about the Scope 3 then as being absolutely critical, and we are largely organisations of people who sit with computers and think and talk and persuade. So there's a lot of physical activity involved that's in the hands of others, which is that Scope 3 supply chain issue. I wonder what are you doing, Kathy, in your supply chain, and how how many suppliers are we talking about? What kind of scale? And tell us what kind of engagement you're having with your supply chain to help in the process.
Oh, this is something we could go on and on and on about. There's a lot to unpick here. We work with roughly, I think it's 35 to 40 different printers across the globe. Benefits of print-on-demand publishing: great, you have localized printing. Downside is you have more suppliers to work with. But what we've been finding is that definitely in the UK, in Europe, printers are a lot further ahead in thinking about their own sustainability goals, their own targets, whether that's setting net zero targets themselves, looking at their different emission scopes. They're further ahead than America, definitely further ahead than India, where we operate as well, and certainly in places like Singapore to an extent. What we've been focusing on recently is printer engagement, having the conversations about this is a shared responsibility to get to net zero. What are you doing?
Yep.
Quantifying for them the impact of their business for us in ways that speak to them, and having wider conversations about their role in the industry as a whole. And I think that's one of the key things for the publishing industry as a whole is not having publishers silo themselves, not having printers silo themselves, but looking at the full value chain, whether that's distributors or whether it's printers or publishers. So it's that engagement conversation we're having. We're doing a lot more analysis of data. I thought working in sustainability would involve me doing a lot more tree hugging, perhaps, groundbreaking projects saving the world. It's not like that.
It's Excel
it's data. And don't get me wrong, I love the data. You cannot make informed decisions without having the data, and often the big struggle in our jobs is you arrive into a role that might be newly created and you go, okay, well, where's the data? Oh, there isn't any. We don't have any data. Yeah. And it's about uncovering that and making informed decisions based on what you have and working towards filling in the gaps where you don't have data, so you can have those informed conversations and make informed decisions.
Thanks, Kathy. Zoe, anything to add on that supply chain?
Yeah, I mean, I guess so. I'm sure Kathy's experience is the same. Our engagement with supply, I mean, the printers that we source from are the sort of key suppliers we work with directly. Our engagement is evolving from us sharing a policy and asking for data to having that conversation. I think, and I really like Scott's NHS slide, which I'll be perusing on the train home later, which is, okay, so we've been asking for data and we've been asking what their strategies are, and we're members of the Book Chain project, which I really recommend people take a look at if you're already members, or there are some resources available for non-members as well. There are sort of key industry group that we're part of that we use the most. There's tons of data in there from printers, but also from mills, just to understand the impact and the level of commitment in the supply chain. So we need to move towards, not just asking for stuff, but actually having it be requirements. If you're going to work with us, if you're going to supply us, and again, I probably haven't quite got there with the influencing yet, if you're going to be a supplier to OUP, you have to do these things. And so that's coming. Not in a stick way, but more of in a carrot way of sort of, the whole sector. There's good reasons for you to do this. I think 80% of the mills that we source from indirectly are in China and India in areas of very high climate and water risk. Actually, there's a lot of incentive for those suppliers to take action to reduce their exposure to that by changing the way they operate, using less water, that kind of thing. The other thing that's coming, just to briefly touch on, I don't even dare say the acronym is EUDR, the EU Deforestation Regulations, which comes into force 31st of December this year. Nobody's ready. The EU's not ready, we're not ready, no other publisher's ready. That's going to take our data need and those spreadsheets to a whole other level, because we're expected to disclose to the EU the exact forest source of each tree, pretty much, that goes into our publications. And obviously paper's a kind of a commodity. It's not like if IKEA's buying loads and loads of wood from Finland, that's one forest source. Our papers, I looked at the paper we use the most of, I think in one batch of that paper brand, there were 20 different forest sources from all around the world, but then the next batch that had been tested had maybe 10 completely different forest sources. So it's a bit of a minefield, but that's what's coming in terms of complexity, and that will change our supplier relationships as well.
There we are, something to look forward to.
Absolutely.
I'm just going to move on. Just thinking, as an industry, as you know, what we do in our jobs, it's not making toothbrushes or whatever. It's actually disseminating knowledge, educating, informing, and so on. I wonder what we, whether as a university or as publishers, can do that's special and different in spreading this message. Scott, have you thought about this at all?
Yeah, the example, one of the main themes in the climate strategy refresh that I'm leading just now is rebalance. That's the first thing that I talk about with colleagues. What I mean by that is, if you do a UKHE best practice review on climate strategy going backwards, what you'll find in a 10-page document is 9 pages of operational carbon and 1 page on research, teaching and learning and partnerships. It's upside down, right? Because the core of what we do is that last page. And the biggest impact that we can have is in that last page. And it gets worse, because when you read that last page, what they tended to be was a list of all the great things that we do. So as a university, any university is doing great things in climate and nature usually. And a promise that we'll do more of that. That's not a strategy, that's a list. So we're really not paying enough attention to that brain print, if you like, rather than footprint. And so I want to flip that on its head, and any new strategy we write, imagine for ease of maths, it's 12 pages long. The first 3 pages will be learning and teaching, and the next 3 will be research. And in that 3 pages of learning and teaching, what I want to talk about is how do we enable and empower the 10,000 graduates that we graduate every year with information on climate and nature should they be interested in studying it. And that's going to be a big change that hopefully you'll see in the strategy when we publish it later in the year. I'm fairly confident we'll get this through, where we used to talk about the fact that we had, 30 courses, 40 courses dedicated to climate and nature. But in the future, any student who studies at the University of Edinburgh, doesn't matter what degree they do, they will be able to study meaningfully climate and nature, and by meaningful I mean assessed, credit-bearing, part of their degree programme, should they choose to do so. That's what we're working towards just now. Now, if each of those 10,000 students goes into the world and saves 10 tons of carbon, say, and I can save that in my sleep, that's nothing. Within 2 years, they will be outstripping our operational footprint. 2 years, just by doing that. So thinking differently about, unique. Yeah. What is it about us that can make a difference in the world? It's not really our operational footprint. We do need to take care of that, otherwise we'd be accused of hypocrisy, and quite rightly so. But it's what impact can we make in the world as a university? And I think, I'm sure Zoe and Catherine will talk about that in the press.
Yeah, terrific. And as publishers, producing thousands of book titles and journal titles over the year, how do we make a difference? How do we engage our authors? How do we engage our readership? What's the element there, Cathy?
Yeah, it's interesting to have Scott here, because it's almost like a feeder system. Yeah. We're feeding content that hopefully supports what you're trying to do in terms of inspiring students, researchers, etc. I kind of see our role as disseminators and curators of knowledge, but I think it goes beyond the environmental agenda, where we spoke, some of the earlier speakers spoke a little bit about AI and its impacts. Well, I think we're starting to feel the repercussions and the dangers there in terms of, the research output that we're seeing, ethics issues, and our role as publishers is not necessarily to serve as gatekeepers, but as safeguarders to ensure that what we're publishing is truthful, is accurate, combats disinformation, that sort of thing. So that's one area of impact that we definitely need to be doing more in as a collective industry. But I think discoverability is the other element. As publishers, what we need to be doing is making sure the content we're producing that addresses big societal problems is in a format that is appropriate for all of our audiences, whether that be students or researchers, but also increasingly policymakers, because they're the ones who are making decisions that will make big changes.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
Zoe, can Scott's 10,000 students come to OUP and find rich resources to help them on their journey?
Hopefully so. And that's another metric that my colleagues are working on, especially in the academic division, looking at number of journal articles on different SDG topics and that kind of thing. I mean, only one thing to add really, which is I think, and talking about misinformation, of which there's much, I think, we're sort of trusted voice with a fairly captive audience. So if we didn't use that as a sort of, without sounding cheesy, a force for good, we'd be missing a trick. But I think,
yeah, terrific.
Opportunity.
Right. I have more questions, but I want to give the opportunity to the audience to put any questions you would like to this panel. I see one hand on stage left. No, not stage left. Anyway, that side. Yes.
Hi, Simon Holt from Elsevier.
Thank you.
Really interesting discussion. Thanks very much. I heard a lot there about kind of print and paper, right, and what we're doing about this. And I think the publishing industry has done a lot in the past 25 years to move towards a sort of digital-first ecosystem, which from a sustainability point of view is great. However, I read a report recently that said basically that the fastest growing threat to climate change or contributor to carbon emissions was actually data servers and the heat caused by data servers, right? We are fundamentally in the business of data. Mm-hmm. This report told me that I think every day the world doubles the amount of emissions emitted from data servers, right? And as an industry, this is something that we're really going to need to think about. So I wondered if the panel had been thinking about looking forward to the next 25 years, how we tackle and what publishers can do particularly to tackle the climate change and carbon emissions that are caused by data usage and data servers and data storage.
Thank you. Yeah. Who would like to pick that up?
I can jump in with a few thoughts. Yeah, it's a really great question. So at the moment, I would say, personally, my focus is so heavily on print because when we look at our footprint now, even though we are increasingly digital, I think the sort of the number that gets bandied around is that the footprint of a digital book is about 10% that of if it were printed. So it's it's a big increase if you're talking about print. However, as you say, if we're increasing our digital output, that number is going to go up, and if we're reducing print at the same time, that number's going to come down, so we will need to rebalance. I think the principles are the same in terms of working with suppliers. It's just that the suppliers we're talking about are Microsoft and Amazon and enormous corporations that have, I haven't analysed them in depth yet, but I think fairly ambitious carbon reduction plans. Just one thing, and I won't go into detail because I know Kathy's got experience of this as well. The sector, the publishing industry, is part of a collaboration called DIMPACT or D-Impact, which is looking at initially measuring the footprint of digital product. And I guess my little caveat is, yes, we're doubling, but is that how much of that is coming from digital publishing versus everything else that's going on that needs data? I think AI is the big question mark. Our footprint's going to radically go up from digital if we move to AI.
Thank you. Anything to add on server output? Go ahead, Scott. And then there's one more question, I think, at the back. Yeah.
So I think there are aspects of this that make it a temporary problem, still a big problem, right? But a temporary one in the sense that at the moment you still have grids that are partially powered by fossil fuels, so you still have carbon associated to where the energy is coming from for those big data centers. But as we decarbonize the grid, the footprint of those data centers goes down. So although electricity use is going up, the carbon intensity of the electricity is going down, and at some point, certainly within the UK, we get to close to zero on the grid, and that's actually been making really good progress. Of course, it depends where those data centers are situated and what the electricity intensity is, but in some sense it's temporary. There are water issues as well in terms of the water usage of those data centers that need to be taken separately. And there are a variety of things that we can do to reduce the impact of the data centers in terms of the way that they're run and the way that we do software coding and things like that. But as Zoe was saying, it is much better than print that we're moving in those directions. But I think Zoe's spot on in saying the publishing sector is probably a relatively small element of that. It's largely in AI and large models, and we've got our own problem with that in that we're about to host the UK's next supercomputer, and it will be 80% of our electricity usage when it comes in. It's absolutely humongous.
Yeah.
The irony being, we need it to run climate models
Yeah.
and other such things, modelling health impacts and things like that. So it's going to do great things in helping solve the world problems. It's not going to help us with our own carbon footprint in the short term in terms of trying to solve that.
Yeah.
What do you do with that?
Thank you. I think we have time for one more question, and there was a hand raised. Yes, thank you.
Hi, it's Cora Corditz from Crossref. So I just want to turn around the question that I think you've asked Oliver about the scholars themselves or academics themselves. Has there been engagement back from academics, whether as editors or as authors or as readers, making an influence or impact or demands on any of your organizations in any of those areas, or, I don't know, delivering data or insights that you were able to use in a meaningful way?
Thank you. Kathy, are you hearing from authors and others? Is there a voice of...
A little bit, a little bit. Not as much as you might expect,
No.
although we're hearing increasingly more from societies, especially in the tender process for society-run journals. It's really encouraging to see within those requests for proposals are some often quite detailed questions about our approach to sustainability, the progress we're making, our policies, etc. I'd say that's probably the most that we're hearing. But when we do put messages out there about tangible progress or action we've taken rather than just commitments, which people are sick to death of hearing about what your targets or commitments are, generally the response is favourable. But I wouldn't say that we're at a point where authors, researchers are voting with their feet and saying, well, you know what, I'm not going to publish it with you because you're not quite as far along in your carbon reduction program as that particular publisher.
I fear I need to get you...
Yeah,
you're
can I
good.
just
Yes.
Just a quick question, we've got a few minutes left. We've been really lucky, Charlotte Mason at Edinburgh University Press, we've been really lucky to have Scott to help advise our sustainability working group. It's been brilliant. And just really quick last one, Scott, how would you advise other university presses to approach their universities, their parent institutions, to help them as individuals, as groups, and to kind of tackle some of their problems?
Oh, good question. I wish you'd told me you were going to ask me that before. Universities have got a huge challenge ahead of them to try and meet their own targets. So I think one of the reasons we engaged with Edinburgh University Press really well was the enthusiasm and the focus that you approached us with. So we're always looking for the elements of the university that want to come with us or that want to drive change in those areas, and that was really clear in the engagement from the start. That's immediately going to get a really positive response from the university itself, because it's a department that is going to help us in our overarching ambition and our aims, which we're already struggling to meet, and isn't consistent across the university, right? We will have some areas that are saying too hard, don't want to know, got other things to do, quite reasonably so in many cases. So I think the first thing is saying we have some dedicated resource in this, or a part of a role, or we have our own ambitions in this, but we're not sure where to start. Could you help us? And we are a significant part of this. We can help contribute to this in X, Y, Z way with whatever data you have. I'm talking about the brain print as well. So we publish X amount or Y amount of journals, or we work with X amount of academics, because I'm always thinking about materiality. I get thousands of requests every day, and they can be anything from, why do we use artificial grass at graduation? Why don't we have a water fountain in this particular cafe, to how are we going to decarbonize our 550 buildings, etc. You can imagine where I focus my efforts. Materiality, right? I focus on the big stuff. I ignore all the little stuff because I just don't have time. So making it clear that you are a material element of the picture as well, in terms of the scale of your operation and the reach that you have, I think will really hook people into what you're doing as well.
Can I just really quickly, Joe, if you want any data, if you can get even roughly the number of tons of paper that you're using, assuming you are printing,
Nice.
the DEFRA conversion factor for ton of paper to ton of carbon is roughly 0.91. It might be 0.9194, but don't hold me to that. So if you want to give an indication of what we use 40,000 tons of paper, I can give you a ballpark figure off the basis of that. OUP is obviously very big, and if you can get that figure from your procurement teams or from your manufacturing teams, you can give them a scale of, you might think your footprint's this, but actually have you counted all the paper that we're using?
Wow. 40,000 tons.
It's a lot.
Wonderful, there's a lot of paper. Wonderful guidance to end the session, because lunch is upon us. So I hope you'll I have a couple of announcements to make in a moment, but first of all, I hope you'll join me in thanking this wonderful panel for all the different perspectives they've brought to this fascinating discussion. Thank you all. My next one is just my second commercial break. On the 26th of this month, I'll be riding Ride London, which is a 100-mile ride from London and back, for the Book Trade charity, which does great work supporting people at all stages of their life in the book trade. If you should want to chip into that cause, do look me up on LinkedIn, and you'll find a link to the fundraising website. But meanwhile, I was going to click. The next session, actually I looked at the app. The next thing is lunch and walk in the park, it says. So that's most inviting, for an hour and a quarter. The next session will be at 1:45 as a plenary back in the Pentland room. But meanwhile, enjoy lunch, and of course, do seek out our speakers if you want to continue the conversation. Thank you very much all.